His wife brought her lover to his mother's funeral, walked him right past the ushers, past the church mothers in their white fans and nurses' uniforms, past the family, and seated him in the family pew. While a grieving son sat alone in the front row, his eyes fixed on his mother's casket, his hands folded in his lap, his face completely still. He didn't cry, he didn't turn around, he didn't say a single word, and when the service ended, he did only one thing. He reached back to his mother's casket, removed a single white lily from the floral arrangement, placed it in the breast pocket of his black suit jacket, and walked out of that church without looking at his wife once. What she didn't know, what her father didn't know, what the man she brought to that funeral didn't know, was that the quiet, unremarkable husband they had spent 9 years dismissing, diminishing and disrespecting was the sole owner of a $5.3 trillion generational trust. And that the ground their entire empire was built on, legally, literally, it belonged to his family. His mother built it, in silence, over 60 years, and the day they buried her, the day his wife chose to make her disrespect permanent and public, was the exact day it all transferred to him. So what do you do when you finally hold everything, and the people who humiliated you don't know it yet? If this story is already getting your attention, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss one of these. We drop new stories every week, and I want to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. We've got people tuning in from all over, and I want to see where our community is watching from. Now let me take you all the way back to where this story begins. To a Tuesday morning in March, inside a church on the south side of Houston, where a funeral was already going wrong before the first hymn was sung. The church smelled like gardenias and old wood, and the particular kind of grief that settles into a room before the service even begins. Wheeler Avenue Baptist had been standing on that corner of 3rd Ward since 1941, and its walls had absorbed enough sorrow over the decades that the building itself seemed to know what to do with it. The pews filled slowly that Tuesday morning, one familiar face at a time. Miss Coretta's church sisters came first, the way they always did. Women in white dresses and white gloves, the Nurses' Guild she had served in for 37 years, fanning themselves with programs that carried her photograph on the front. Nathaniel had chosen that photograph himself. His mother was smiling in it, standing on the porch of the Tierwester Street house, in her Sunday clothes, one hand resting on the rail, like she owned every inch of the world within her reach. She had. None of them knew that yet. Nathaniel Gaines sat in the front pew alone. He wore a black suit he had pressed himself the night before, a white shirt, no tie. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, and his eyes fixed on the white casket at the front of the sanctuary, surrounded by arrangements of white lilies, her favorite, always her favorite. She had told him that every spring when they bloomed in the garden at the back of the house. He had ordered 47 of them. He had counted them when the funeral home set them in place the morning before. Behind him, the pews filled in. Uncle Darnell, his mother's younger brother, settled in the second row with his wife Carolyn and their 3 grown children. Cousins from Beaumont came in quietly, nodding at each other, taking up the 3rd and 4th rows the way family does, the practiced choreography of shared grief. The choir director, Brother Kelso, moved to the front. The organist began something low and searching. The air in Wheeler Avenue Baptist settled into that particular stillness that only exists in a room full of people waiting to say goodbye. The service was scheduled for 11. At 11:40, the rear doors of the sanctuary opened. Nathaniel did not turn around. He did not need to. He heard it in the sound that moved through the room. Not a gasp, not words, something quieter and more devastating than either. It was the sound of a congregation registering something that could not be politely ignored and choosing, out of respect for the dead, to say nothing about it. Simone Beauvais-Gaines walked Garrison Wells down the center aisle of her husband's mother's funeral like she was arriving at a dinner party she was only mildly interested in attending. Garrison Wells was 36 years old and had the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been made to feel out of place anywhere. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him well, a pale blue pocket square, shoes that announced themselves. He walked beside Simone with his hand at the small of her back. Easy, familiar, the practiced ease of a man who had been in that position many times. Simone wore black, but it was the kind of black that dressed up rather than down. Her hair was done. Her earrings caught the light. She walked past the ushers without pausing. She walked past Miss Coretta's Nurses' Guild sisters, who tracked her movement with eyes that had seen a great deal in a great many years and recognized immediately what they were looking at. She walked past Uncle Darnell, who went very still in a way that had nothing to do with grief. She walked past the cousins from Beaumont, past the choir director, past the stack of extra programs near the end of the aisle, and she guided Garrison Wells into the second pew, the family pew, and sat down beside him as though the space had been reserved for exactly this. Not one person in that building said a word. The organist continued. Brother Kelso looked at his program. The Nurses' Guild fanned themselves with a slightly different energy than before. Nathaniel sat in the front pew and did not move. When the opening prayer began, Simone bowed her head in Garrison's direction. When the soloist rose to sing His Eye is on the Sparrow, Miss Coretta's song, the one she had requested herself, the one she used to hum while she graded papers at the kitchen table on Tierwester Street, Simone rested her head on Garrison Wells's shoulder. She closed her eyes. He let her. Nathaniel listened to every word of that song. He listened with his eyes open and his hands still, and his face carrying an expression that was not grief and not anger, and was not, if you looked closely enough, anything as simple as pain. It was the expression of a man performing the very last calculation of a very long equation. The recessional began. The family rose. As Nathaniel stood, he turned, not toward Simone, not toward the congregation, not toward the doors at the back of the church. He turned toward the casket. He reached into the nearest floral arrangement, the one that had stood at his mother's right hand through the entire service, and he removed a single white lily from the arrangement. He looked at it for a moment. Then he placed it in the breast pocket of his black suit jacket, smoothed the fabric over it with one hand and turned toward the doors. He walked out of Wheeler Avenue Baptist without looking at his wife once. Every person in that church saw him take the flower. Not one of them understood what it meant. It was not grief. It was not sentiment. It was a man marking the hour the clock started. To understand what happened inside Wheeler Avenue Baptist that March morning, you have to go back 9 years. You have to go back to the beginning, to the version of the story that Simone Beauvais told herself, and the one her father told everyone else. Nathaniel had met Simone at a fundraiser for a Third Ward literacy program, the kind of event that drew a specific cross-section of Houston's black professional class. People who wanted to be seen doing good as much as they wanted to do it. Simone was there on her father's behalf. She was 32, sharp-eyed, and wearing a dress that cost more than most people's car notes. Nathaniel was there because Miss Coretta had organized the book drive and asked him to help carry boxes. He was wearing a plain grey suit and sensible shoes. She was drawn to something in him she could not name, and would later spend 9 years misidentifying as Simplicity. They dated for 14 months. Nathaniel was attentive, steady, and unhurried in the way of a man who has never needed anything from another person badly enough to perform for it. He took Simone to quiet dinners and walked her home and called when he said he would call. He told her he did consulting work from a home office. He told her he kept things simple. She heard what she wanted to hear and filled in the rest with assumptions she never thought to examine. When he proposed, she said yes. When she told her father, Pierre Beauvais set down his bourbon glass with the particular deliberateness of a man swallowing something unpleasant. The rehearsal dinner was held at Pierre's River Oaks estate, 12,000 square feet of pale stone and imported marble, the kind of house that existed to make everyone inside it aware of the distance between themselves and the man who owned it. Pierre stood at the head of the table in a cream linen suit and introduced Nathaniel to his assembled guests with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He called him Simone's young man from the ward. He said it the way you might describe a stray that had found its way to the door. And then, with the table watching, he raised his glass and said, with the smoothest delivery imaginable, that he supposed every family needed the help with a ring. The table laughed. Simone looked at her champagne glass. Nathaniel smiled and said nothing. That was the first dinner. There would be 43 more over 9 years in that house, and at restaurants Pierre chose, and at charity galas where Pierre introduced Nathaniel to powerful men with the same pleasant condescension, always steering the conversation away before Nathaniel could establish himself in it. Pierre was surgical in his dismissals. He never shouted, never threatened. He simply constructed every shared space so that Nathaniel occupied the smallest possible portion of it. The first Thanksgiving, Pierre seated Nathaniel at the far end of the table, near his younger grandchildren, away from the adults, away from the conversation about the corridor expansion and the new financing and the properties coming online in the Galleria district. It was Miss Coretta who noticed. She had driven up from Tierwester Street with a sweet potato pie and a covered dish of her cornbread dressing, the same things she brought every year, and she walked to the table, looked at the place cards with an expression that disclosed nothing, and simply rearranged them. She moved Nathaniel's card to the seat beside her, midway up the table, where a person could see and be seen. Pierre watched her do it. He laughed and said she was a pistol. Miss Coretta thanked him for having her and sat down. Simone said nothing. Nathaniel drove a 2018 Ford Fusion that he kept clean and serviced on schedule. He wore plain suits and kept a tidy home office. He worked consistent hours and never discussed his work in detail, and when anyone pressed, he would say pleasantly that it was asset management mostly, not very interesting, and change the subject. He did not own a watch that announced itself. He did not take calls at dinner. He did not need people to know anything about him. Simone's friends found him pleasant, and vague. Her father found him beneath consideration. Simone herself had made a quiet peace with the understanding that Nathaniel would never be the kind of man her father respected, ambitious, vocal, performing his worth in public at every opportunity. She told herself she had married him for other reasons. Over time, she had trouble remembering what those reasons were. Miss Coretta visited the Midtown house every third Sunday, without fail, with food. She brought pot roast or chicken and rice, or, in the cooler months, a pot of her vegetable soup that took the whole house over with the smell of it. She would sit at the kitchen table with Nathaniel while the food warmed and talk about the neighborhood and the church and the children she used to teach. She would watch Simone move through the kitchen the way you watch weather, noting direction, noting temperature, saying very little about what she observed. She studied Simone with the patient eyes of a woman who had spent 40 years reading children, who could tell within the first week of school which ones would grow toward the light, and which ones had already decided the light was for other people. She never said a word about what she saw. 9 years passed like that. Dinner after dinner, dismissal after dismissal, silence following silence. Nathaniel absorbed every slight with the same composed stillness he had shown at the rehearsal dinner, the same slight smile that gave away nothing, the same unhurried patience that Pierre Beauvais mistook for acceptance. It was not acceptance, but that particular misunderstanding was about to become the most expensive mistake Pierre Beauvais ever made. Garrison Wells arrived in the Beauvais family orbit the way expensive problems always arrive, smoothly, with good shoes, and an introduction from someone who should have known better. Pierre brought him to a Sunday dinner at the River Oaks estate 18 months before Miss Coretta passed. He introduced him as a junior partner at Beauvais Development, a talented architect with a vision for the corridor expansion, a young man who understood what it meant to build something that lasted. Pierre said all of this while looking at Garrison. He said none of it while looking at Nathaniel. Garrison Wells was 36 years old and constructed entirely out of borrowed confidence. He drove a G-Wagon that the dealership technically owned. He wore linen in November, which in Houston was possible, but was also a statement. He spoke about the Third Ward the way people speak about neighborhoods they have visited twice and plan to profit from, with the bright, hollow enthusiasm of someone who had never needed to belong anywhere. He called it up and coming. He said it with a smile. He said it to Nathaniel, who had grown up 2 streets over from the church, where his mother's body would one day lie in a white casket surrounded by white lilies. Nathaniel smiled back and said nothing. Simone noticed Garrison the way a woman notices something that confirms what she already wanted to believe. He was everything Pierre had always suggested Nathaniel was not. Vocal, performing, filling the room with the specific energy of a man who needed to be seen. He talked about projects with the enthusiasm of someone who had not yet been responsible for enough of them to be humbled. Pierre laughed at his jokes. Simone watched her father laugh. Within 6 weeks, she stopped wearing her wedding ring to Pierre's dinners. She did not take it off at home, not at first. She would remove it quietly before she left for Pierre's events, and slide it back on when she returned, as though the marriage existed only in the spaces her father could not see. Nathaniel noticed the first time she did it. He watched her set it on the bathroom counter before a November dinner, pick up her purse, and walk out to her car. He stood in the doorway of the bathroom for a moment after she left. Then he went back to his desk and returned to work. He said nothing. The dinners continued. The corridor expansion became Pierre's obsession. $240 million in new development, new tenants, new debt restructured against the portfolio. He talked about it at every gathering with the breathless excitement of a man who believed he was building a legacy. Garrison would spread architectural renderings across Pierre's dining table after dessert, and Pierre would stand over them with his reading glasses and his bourbon, pointing at parcels and percentages, speaking about the land as though it had always been his and always would be. Nathaniel sat at the far end of the table on those evenings, eating his food, listening to the conversation that did not include him, watching his wife lean toward the renderings with an interest she had never shown in anything that belonged to their shared life. Pierre spoke over Nathaniel when he did speak. He redirected conversations that drifted toward him. He treated Nathaniel's presence at his table like a minor inconvenience he had long since learned to manage. And Garrison, who was clever enough to understand the social architecture of the room, followed Pierre's lead exactly, deferring to him, echoing him, and treating the man at the end of the table as furniture. By the following spring, Garrison had been to 3 family events. At the second, Simone had driven separately. At the third, they had arrived together. Nobody challenged it, nobody asked. Pierre watched it happen and looked satisfied in the way of a man whose plan was proceeding on schedule. Miss Coretta came to 2 of those dinners. She brought food both times, her chicken and rice the first time, a sweet potato pound cake the second. And she sat at the table with the same careful stillness she always brought to the Beauvais house. She watched Garrison perform. She watched Pierre conduct him. She watched Simone stop reaching for Nathaniel across the table the way she used to, watched the small gestures of a marriage going quiet 1 degree at a time. On a Sunday evening in late February, 6 weeks before she died, Miss Coretta called Nathaniel after he had driven her home from church. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always did for her. She said, "Baby, I need to talk to you about the papers. I want to make sure you understand everything before I get any older." He told her he would come Saturday. He told her they would sit at the kitchen table the way they always did, with sweet tea, and she could explain whatever she wanted to explain. She said that sounded fine. She said she loved him. He said he loved her back. On Tuesday morning at 6:15, Miss Coretta Gaines sat down in her armchair on Tierwester Street, closed her eyes, and her heart simply stopped. Nathaniel never got his Saturday. But Miss Coretta, who had spent 60 years building something in silence, had made certain that her son would not need the conversation. What she had prepared for him was better than words. It was already waiting. In the roll-top desk in the front room of the house on Tierwester Street, in a sealed manila envelope with his name written on the front in her careful school-teacher's hand. 3 days after they buried Miss Coretta, Nathaniel went back to Tierwester Street alone. Simone had not offered to come. She had spent the days since the funeral at her father's River Oaks estate, which told Nathaniel everything about the shape of his marriage that he had not already known. He drove to the old house in the Ford Fusion with the windows down, the way he always drove through 3rd Ward in the early morning, slowly, without urgency, taking in the streets that had built him before the world had a chance to. The house smelled the way it always smelled, lemon oil and old books and the faint ghost of every pot of soup Miss Coretta had ever made in that kitchen. Nathaniel stood in the front room for a moment, just standing, letting the stillness of it settle around him. Then he walked to the roll-top desk in the corner by the window, the one she had owned since before he was born, the one with the worn brass pulls and the drawer that stuck in humid weather, and he began to clear it. He found the envelope in the second drawer from the bottom. It was a standard manila envelope, sealed and labelled in Miss Coretta's precise schoolteacher handwriting, for Nathaniel, the trust. It was not hidden. It was not tucked under anything or folded inside something else. She had placed it there to be found by the one person she knew would come looking, and she had labelled it plainly because that was how she did everything. No drama, no mystery, just the thing itself, waiting. Nathaniel carried the envelope to the kitchen table and sat down. He sat there for a long time before he opened it. Inside were 4 documents. The first was a land deed dated 1959, handwritten on paper that had yellowed at the edges. The original conveyance of 340 acres in 3rd Ward to James Cornelius Gaines, his grandfather, in a transaction that preceded nearly everything that currently stood on that land. The second was a secondary instrument from 1974, 2 pages, recording the sale of surface rights to the city of Houston, and, on the bottom of page 2, the explicit retention of the ground lease interest by the Gaines Family Trust, filed in a secondary county index that a thorough attorney would find and a careless one would miss. The third document was the formation paperwork for Gaines Capital Quiet LP, a Delaware limited partnership, showing Nathaniel Gaines as sole beneficial owner. The fourth was a single page, a current asset summary dated 2 months prior, with a number at the bottom that Nathaniel read 3 times before he set the paper down: $5.3 trillion. He sat at his mother's kitchen table with that number in front of him and looked out the window at the yard where she had grown her white lilies every spring for as long as he could remember. The same yard, the same soil, the same quiet house on the same quiet street, 2 blocks from where the Beauvais corridor rose out of the ground in glass and steel and concrete, built on a foundation that Pierre Beauvais had never actually purchased. Nathaniel put the documents back in the envelope. He picked up his keys. He drove to Fannin Street. Reginald Okafor met him at the door of the office personally. He was a compact, careful man of 52 with reading glasses on a chain and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades translating enormous things into plain language. He had administered the Gaines Family Quiet Trust for 11 years under Miss Coretta's direction. When Nathaniel called that morning, Okafor had already been expecting him. Miss Coretta had updated the trust documentation 2 months prior and told Okafor that her son would be coming after she was gone. She had said it, Okafor told him, the same way she said everything. They sat in the conference room, and Okafor walked him through the structure with the patience of a man who understood that the weight of a number like 5.3 trillion was not absorbed quickly. He explained the ground lease retention, how the 1974 instrument had been correctly recorded in a secondary filing index that Pierre Beauvais' title attorneys had searched in 1998 and simply missed, how 60 years of ground lease payments, mineral rights income from 4 Gulf state parcels, legal settlements, and disciplined reinvestment had built Gaines Capital Quiet LP into what it currently was, how the trust held controlling silent interests in 2 regional banks, infrastructure bonds, and private equity stakes in 12 logistics companies across the southern United States. And then Okafor slid a document across the table. It was a title search on the Beauvais corridor, current, comprehensive. Okafor set his finger on a line near the bottom of page 3, a notation referencing the secondary index filing from 1974, the ground lease retention instrument, the Gaines Family Trust as the controlling ground interest. Right there. Missed by every attorney Pierre Beauvais had ever hired. For 26 years, Pierre had built his empire on a foundation he believed he owned. He had never owned the ground beneath a single inch of it. Nathaniel looked at the document for a long time. Then he asked Okafor 2 questions. He asked whether the ground lease claim could be filed through a holding entity rather than under his own name. Okafor said yes. He asked whether the claim, once filed, would immediately cloud every title on the corridor and halt all pending transactions, including any active refinancing packages. Okafor said yes within 72 hours automatically. Nathaniel nodded. Then he asked if he could have a glass of water. While Okafor stepped out, Nathaniel reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. He set the white lily on the conference table in front of him, still intact, still pale and clean, still exactly as it had been when he lifted it from his mother's casket 4 days ago. He looked at it. Then he looked at the title search. He didn't ask Okafor what he could do. When Okafor came back with the water, Nathaniel was ready. He told him exactly what he had decided. Okafor came back with the water. He set it on the table and sat down across from Nathaniel and waited, the way a man waits when he already knows the next thing said will matter. Nathaniel drank half the glass. He set it down. He looked at the white lily on the table between them. Then he looked at Okafor and told him what he wanted done. He did not raise his voice. He did not use emotional language. He spoke the way his mother had always explained important things, plainly, in sequence, with a glass nearby. And he gave Okafor 4 directives with the calm precision of a man who had been thinking about this since the moment he reached into his mother's casket arrangement and took a flower that was never just a flower. The first directive was this: file the ground lease claim against every title on the Beauvais corridor through a holding entity. Okafor was to register a new Texas LLC that morning, Gaines Land Holdings, and execute the filing under that name. Not Nathaniel Gaines, not the Gaines Family Quiet Trust, not yet. Pierre Beauvais would receive the claim and not know who was behind it, and that uncertainty was part of the plan. Okafor nodded and wrote. The second directive: issue a formal ground lease default notice to Pierre Beauvais personally, certified mail, to his River Oaks address and his Galleria office simultaneously. The notice would invoke the 30-day cure period required by Texas property law, a provision that existed not because Nathaniel expected Pierre to cure anything, but because the law required the offer before the consequences could be made permanent. Okafor confirmed he could draft the notice the same afternoon. Nathaniel said that would be fine. The third directive was a single certified letter to the title insurance desk at Centennial Bank. Factual, brief, no commentary. It would state that a valid ground lease claim had been filed against the Beauvais corridor properties, currently securing an active refinancing package, and that the claimant's documentation was available for review upon request. Okafor understood immediately what that letter would do. An $800 million refinancing package cannot survive a title cloud. The insurance would be suspended before the week was out. He said so. Nathaniel said he knew. The fourth directive was quieter. Okafor was to prepare a formal disclosure of Gaines Capital, Quiet LP's silent controlling interest in First Southern Regional Bank, not to file it publicly, not yet, but to have it ready, and to place a management directive on file with the bank's board, notifying them that the controlling interest was now active and under new stewardship. First Southern Regional Bank held Pierre Beauvais' personal mortgage on the River Oaks estate. It held Simone's auto loan. It held the revolving credit line that Garrison Wells's architectural firm operated against, guaranteed through Beauvais Development. Nathaniel told Okafor he wanted Garrison's credit facility flagged specifically. Okafor looked at him over his reading glasses. He wrote it down without asking why. The timeline, Okafor confirmed, would run as follows. The title cloud would be filed within 72 hours of their conversation, automatically triggering the title dispute notation against every Beauvais corridor property in the Harris County records. The bank notification would go out simultaneously. Pierre Beauvais would receive the certified mail on day 5. The management directive to First Southern would activate on day 6. Nathaniel listened to the timeline. He asked no further questions. He picked up the white lily from the conference table and placed it back in his breast pocket. He buttoned his jacket. He thanked Reginald Okafor for his time and for 11 years of service to his mother and for the glass of water. Okafor stood and extended his hand. When they shook, Okafor held the grip for a moment and said quietly that Miss Coretta had known what she was building and she had known who she was building it for. Nathaniel nodded once. Then he walked out of the office on Fannin Street into the late afternoon Houston heat. He drove home to the Midtown house. He changed out of his suit. He made dinner, rice, red beans, the cornbread his mother had taught him to make in a cast-iron skillet, and he ate at the kitchen table by himself with the television on low. He washed the dishes. He sat on the couch with a book he did not read. Somewhere around 9 in the evening he set the book down and closed his eyes and was asleep before he consciously decided to be. Simone came home at 11. She came in quietly, the way she had been coming in late for the better part of a year. No announcement, no greeting called into the dark house, just the sound of her keys and her heels on the hardwood, and the particular silence of a woman who had stopped calculating whether anyone was waiting for her. She passed through the living room. She saw Nathaniel on the couch. She did not wake him. She went upstairs. Nathaniel did not move. He was not asleep. He lay still in the dark of his own living room with his hands folded across his chest, the same way he had sat in the front pew at Wheeler Avenue Baptist, the same expression on his face. Patient, complete. The expression of a man who has already set something in motion and has nothing left to do but wait for it to arrive. 5 days later, a certified letter arrived at Pierre Beauvai's River Oaks estate at 9 in the morning. Pierre signed for it himself. The letter arrived at the River Oaks estate at 9 in the morning, carried by a postal carrier who required a signature. Pierre Beauvais signed for it himself, standing in the doorway in his robe, because he was the kind of man who believed that receiving certified mail in a robe communicated something important about his relationship to urgency. He carried it inside without opening it, set it on the kitchen counter, poured his coffee, and read the morning paper for 20 minutes before he bothered to look at the return address. Gaines Land Holdings, LLC, Austin, Texas. He didn't recognize the name. He opened the envelope with the measured disinterest of a man who had been in real estate long enough to believe that no legal letter could tell him anything he wasn't already prepared to handle. He read the first paragraph. His coffee went cold. The letter stated in the flat, declarative language of a filing notice that Gaines Land Holdings LLC had recorded a valid ground lease interest claim against all 340 acres comprising the Beauvais Corridor Development, Harris County, State of Texas, pursuant to an instrument originally executed in 1974 and retained in the secondary filing index of the county records. The claim was supported by documentation available upon request. All parties holding title interests in the affected parcels were hereby notified that the ground lease interest superseded surface ownership and that a formal cure period of 30 days was now in effect. Pierre read it twice. Then he picked up his phone and called Gerald Fontenot. Fontenot was his real estate attorney, a careful, expensive man who had handled every Beauvais corridor transaction for the past 18 years. Pierre read him the letter over the phone with the tone of a man reporting an irritating misunderstanding. He said it was probably a nuisance claim. He said someone was fishing. He told Fontenot to make it go away before lunch. Fontenot asked him to hold. The silence that followed lasted 4 minutes. Pierre stood at his kitchen window looking out at his pool. When Fontenot came back on the line, his voice had changed. It was quieter, more careful. He told Pierre not to discuss the matter over the phone. He told him to come to the office. Now, Pierre arrived at Fontenot's office on Post Oak Boulevard 40 minutes later, still in his driving clothes, and found Fontenot already seated at his conference table with a document pulled up on his laptop and a printed page beside it. Fontenot did not stand when Pierre walked in. He pointed at the chair across from him. The document on the laptop was a Harris County Property Index search. The printed page was 2 pages long. The 1974 instrument retaining the ground lease interest for the Gaines Family Trust, filed in the secondary index, clear and valid, and dated 49 years ago. Fontenot looked at Pierre over his reading glasses and said simply that it was real, that the instrument had been correctly filed, that every title search his office had run on the corridor properties since 1998 had searched the primary index only, that this was a documented, valid prior ground lease interest, and that it superseded every surface title Pierre held. Pierre stared at the page. Fontenot said quietly that the corridor titles were clouded as of the filing date. All of them, every parcel, simultaneously. Pierre called the Centennial Bank vice president from Fontenot's parking lot. The call lasted 6 minutes. The bank's title insurance department had received notification of the ground lease claim the same morning the letter arrived at the River Oaks estate. A certified letter from Okafor and Associates, factual, 1 page, no commentary. The title insurer had reviewed the documentation and suspended coverage on the $800 million refinancing package pending resolution of the ground lease dispute. Without title insurance, the refinancing could not close. The bank vice president told Pierre they would need to revisit the timeline. Pierre told him to find a solution. The bank vice president told him there was no solution until the title issue was resolved. The call ended, $800 million gone before noon. Pierre sat in his car in Fontenot's parking garage for 11 minutes. Then he started making calls. He had 3 contacts in Houston with the resources and the reach to trace a Delaware LLC back to its beneficial owner, a title researcher, a private intelligence firm, and a former county clerk who owed him a favor. He called all 3. The title researcher said the Delaware registration was airtight, a single-member LLC with a registered agent and no public beneficial owner disclosure required under state law. The intelligence firm said it would take time they didn't currently have. The former county clerk said he'd look into it and never call back. Pierre drove to his Galleria office and sat behind his desk and stared at the wall. At 4 in the afternoon, Simone called him. Her voice was high and tight. She said her bank accounts were showing a freeze, a court order notification, something about a collateral dispute tied to Beauvais Development's holding structure. She said she couldn't access anything. She asked him what was happening. Pierre told her it was a temporary legal matter. He told her it would be resolved. He told her not to worry. He had said those exact words to people before, and they had always been true. He sat alone in his office at 7 in the evening with the lights still on and the city going dark outside his window, and the name Gaines Land Holdings LLC sitting in front of him like a locked door with no key he recognized. He did not know who was behind it. By morning he would have 4 more problems and still no name. Day 6. Garrison Wells arrived at his Midtown office to find a formal suspension notice from Beauvais Development on his desk. The anchor contract, the one that had funded 3 active projects, covered his payroll, and underwritten every material order his firm had placed in the last 14 months, was suspended pending resolution of the corridor title dispute. All work halted immediately. No cure period, no negotiation window, just a 1-page letter with Beauvais Development letterhead and a signature from Pierre's operations manager. Garrison called Pierre. Pierre didn't answer. He called twice more before noon. Still nothing. By 2 in the afternoon, his office manager knocked on his door and told him quietly that the business credit line, the revolving facility guaranteed by Beauvais Development, had been called by First Southern Regional Bank. The full balance was due within 72 hours. Garrison didn't have the balance. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, a flatbed truck pulled into his Midtown office parking lot. 2 men in work shirts checked a clipboard, located the G-Wagon in the 2nd row, and attached it to the truck without ceremony. Garrison watched from his office window. The truck drove away. The parking space was empty. His staff watched from the hallway behind him, and nobody said a word because there was nothing to say that the empty space hadn't already said louder. That was day 6. Day 8, First Southern Regional Bank's Mortgage Review Division sent Pierre Beauvais a certified letter of its own. The letter notified him that his personal mortgage on the River Oaks estate, a 12,000-square-foot property carrying a $4.2 million outstanding balance, had been flagged for accelerated review following identification of irregular payment history on a related commercial account. The bank's new management directive, issued by the controlling interest of record, required a full financial disclosure package within 14 days, or the mortgage would enter formal default proceedings. Pierre called the bank president directly. He had known the man for 11 years. They had attended the same charity gala 3 consecutive years running. The bank president took the call. He was sympathetic. He was also clear. The directive had come from the controlling interest. His hands were tied. He suggested Pierre compile his disclosure materials promptly. Pierre hung up and sat at his desk for a long time. Day 9, the Houston Business Chronicle ran a story. The headline read, "Beauvais Corridor, Title Dispute. Cloud's Major Houston Development Portfolio." The article cited unnamed sources confirming that an $800 million refinancing package with Centennial Bank had collapsed following a ground lease claim of disputed origin. It noted that the corridor represented Pierre Beauvais's primary asset base, and that the title uncertainty had effectively frozen all transactions on the portfolio. It quoted a real estate analyst who used the phrase structural vulnerability. It did not name Gaines Land Holdings LLC. Pierre's public relations contact called it a smear. The article was already being shared in the Houston commercial real estate community like wildfire on a dry day. Day 10, the corridor's 2 anchor retail tenants, a regional grocery chain and a pharmacy group, together representing 40% of the corridor's rental income, both sent formal notices invoking force majeure clauses in their lease agreements. Citing title uncertainty as a material disruption to their ability to operate under clear legal tenancy, both tenants withheld their monthly rent payments pending resolution of the ground lease dispute. Combined, those 2 tenants represented $1.4 million a month. Gone. Simona's accounts remained frozen through all of it. She had been calling her bank daily, getting the same answer. A court-ordered hold tied to collateral obligations connected to Beauvais Development's holding structure pending legal resolution. She had called Fontenot, who told her it was complicated. She had called Pierre, who told her it was being handled. She had called Nathaniel 3 times. Each time, Nathaniel answered on the second ring. Each time, his voice was even and unhurried. He told her he was sorry to hear it. He told her he would look into it. He asked if she needed anything immediately. She said she needed her accounts unfrozen. He said he understood, and that he would see what he could find out. He said it the same way each time, calm, measured, a man in no particular hurry. He was having breakfast at the same Third Ward diner Miss Coretta used to take him to on Saturday mornings when Uncle Darnell spotted him on day 12. The diner was on Blodgett Street, 2 blocks from Tier Wester, a narrow place with green vinyl booths and a counter, and a woman named Miss Gloria who had been making biscuits there since 1988. Nathaniel was in the corner booth with a plate of eggs and grits and a newspaper folded to the business section. Uncle Darnell slid in across from him without being invited, the way family does. He looked at his nephew for a moment. Then he looked at the newspaper. Then he looked back. He said he'd seen the article about the corridor. Nathaniel said it was something. Uncle Darnell watched him for another moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he understands something he was not told directly. He ordered coffee. They ate together without saying much else. Outside the window, Third Ward moved through its morning exactly the way it always had. That evening, Simone sat at her father's kitchen table in River Oaks, while Pierre made phone calls in the next room, his voice strained in a way she had never once heard before in 67 years of watching him navigate the world. She sat with her hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold and looked at the legal papers spread across the table, and looked at the name that kept appearing in every document, every notice, every filing. Gaines Land Holdings LLC. She said it out loud, quietly, to no one in particular. Who is Gaines Land Holdings? The answer was waiting for her. It was sitting in a conference room on Fannin Street, 7 days away. The meeting was framed as a settlement discussion. Okafor had sent the invitation through proper channels, a formal letter to Fontenot's office requesting that Pierre Beauvais and Simone Beauvais-Gaines appear at Okafor and Associates on Fannin Street on day 21 at 10 in the morning to discuss the terms of the ground lease claim and explore potential resolution. It was polite. It was professional. It gave nothing away. Pierre arrived first. He came with Fontenot. And the difference between the man who had walked into rooms for 67 years and the man who walked into that conference room was the difference between a flag at full mast and one hanging still on a windless day. The cream linen suit was gone. He wore dark grey, plain, a suit that fit him correctly but made no argument. There was no pocket square, there was no Bourbonnese in his posture. He sat down at the conference table and set his hands in front of him and looked like a man waiting to find out how much something was going to cost. Simone arrived 7 minutes later. She came alone. Garrison Wells was not with her, had not, by all appearances, been with her for some time. She sat down across from her father without looking at him, her hands folded in her lap, her face carrying the particular blankness of a woman who had spent 3 weeks being told everything was temporary and had begun to understand it was not. Okafor made brief introductions, said he appreciated everyone's time, and excused himself to retrieve documents. He did not come back. Nathaniel had asked him not to. The room was quiet for a moment after Okafor left. Pierre looked at Fontenot. Simone looked at the table. Nathaniel sat at the head of the conference table in a plain, dark suit, his hands folded in front of him the same way they had been folded in the front pew at Wheeler Avenue Baptist on the morning of his mother's funeral. He looked at Pierre. He looked at Simone. He did not speak immediately. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and set the white lily on the conference table between them. It was still intact. 3 weeks in a jacket pocket, and the lily had dried and held its shape, pale and still, like something preserved on purpose. Pierre looked at it. Something shifted in his face, some fragment of recognition working its way through the confusion. He had seen that lily before. He had seen it at Wheeler Avenue Baptist, in the hand of a man he had spent 9 years treating like furniture. Simone's eyes went to it and stayed there. Nathaniel began to speak. His voice was low and unhurried. It had the quality of a man who had been waiting a long time to say something and had no interest in rushing now that the moment had arrived. He told them about James Cornelius Gaines, about the 340-acre land deed from 1959, written in a small attorney's office on a handshake and held in a family trust for 65 years. He told them about 1974, about how his mother's family had sold the surface rights to the city of Houston for fair market value and retained the ground lease interest in a separate instrument, correctly recorded in the secondary county index, never hidden, never fraudulent, simply filed in a place that careless attorneys do not look. He told them that every title search Beauvais Development had ever commissioned had searched the primary index only. He watched Pierre's face while he said this. He told them about Gaines Capital Quiet LP, about the 60 years of reinvestment, ground lease payments, mineral rights income, legal settlements, compounding year over year without announcement or performance, infrastructure bonds, 12 logistics companies, subsurface mineral rights across 4 Gulf states, a controlling silent interest in 2 mid-size regional banks, including First Southern Regional Bank, where Pierre held his personal mortgage on the River Oaks estate and where Simone's auto loan had been serviced for the past 4 years. He told them that as of Miss Coretta's passing, the total asset value of the Gaines family Quiet Trust was $5.3 trillion. He told them that Gaines Land Holdings LLC was his. The silence in that conference room was the kind that comes after something irreversible has been said. Not empty, but full, pressing against the walls from the inside. Pierre spoke first. He said there had to be a resolution. He said he was prepared to negotiate. He said that surely, after 9 years of family, there was a way to find common ground. Nathaniel let him finish. Then he said simply, and without elevation in his voice, "You spent 9 years letting your father call me the help with a ring. You brought another man to my mother's funeral and sat him in my family's pew. You let him hold your hand while the soloist sang the song my mother chose herself. What you never thought to ask, not once in 9 years, was what my mother actually did. She built something. She built everything. And the day you buried her with that man on your arm was the day it all became mine." Pierre opened his mouth. Nathaniel held up one hand. A single, quiet gesture. Pierre closed his mouth. Simone made a sound that was not quite a word. Her composure had been fragmenting since the lily appeared on the table, and now it came apart the rest of the way. Not loudly, not with theatre, just the quiet collapse of a woman understanding in full what she had thrown away and what it had actually been worth. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Her shoulders dropped. The tears came without her permission. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. There was no satisfaction in his expression. There was no cruelty. There was simply the steady gaze of a man who had already finished the accounting and was waiting for the room to catch up. He stood. He picked up the white lily from the conference table, smoothed the lapel of his jacket, and buttoned it. He nodded once at Fontenot. A professional acknowledgement, nothing more. He did not look at Pierre again. He did not look at Simone. He walked out of the conference room on Fannin Street without looking back. The same way he had walked out of Wheeler Avenue Baptist. The settlement terms were not negotiable, and neither was what came next. 6 months after Nathaniel walked out of the conference room on Fannin Street, the Houston Business Press ran a follow-up story. The headline read, "Beauvais Corridor Portfolio transferred following ground lease settlement." The article was brief and factual. It noted that Pierre Beauvais had reached a settlement agreement with Gaines Land Holdings LLC, the details of which were confidential, but that the transfer of ground lease rights had resulted in a fundamental restructuring of the corridor's ownership architecture. It noted that Beauvais Development had ceased active operations. It did not mention that Pierre had surrendered every corridor parcel rather than pay 65 years of background lease payments at market rate, because the number would have been staggering enough to require its own article. The River Oaks estate sold under mortgage acceleration 32 days after the conference room meeting. First Southern Regional Bank processed the sale with the efficient patience of an institution that had all the time in the world and none of the sentiment. The 12,000-square-foot house on the manicured lot went to a tech executive from Austin who had never heard of Pierre Beauvais and did not need to. Pierre relocated to a condominium in Metairie, Louisiana, which was where he had started and which had never been enough for him, and which was now all there was. Garrison Wells dissolved his architectural firm quietly in the last week of April. He did not announce it. He did not post about it. He was simply gone from Houston one morning, his Midtown office dark, his name removed from the building directory, his forwarding address unknown to everyone who had once been delighted to know him. The people who had attended his events and praised his renderings and called him talented moved on without pausing, the way people move on from things that were never as substantial as they appeared. Simone's assets were unfrozen following the divorce settlement in early May. What remained after the court-ordered collateral obligations were satisfied was a fraction of what she had spent 9 years believing was her inheritance. The designer wardrobe was hers, the lease on the Midtown condo was hers, the real estate broker's license was hers. Everything she had actually owned herself, separate from her father's empire and her father's name, fit into a much smaller life than the one she had constructed around both. She was 41 years old. She would have to build something on her own, perhaps for the first time. Nathaniel did not watch any of this. He had other things to do. In June, the Miss Coretta Gaines Foundation was formally established with a $200 million endowment drawn from Gaines Capital Quiet LP. The foundation's stated mission was the education and advancement of Third Ward children, fully funded teacher salary supplements at 4 public elementary schools, annual college scholarships for graduating seniors from the Third Ward attendance zone, and a new library wing at the school where Miss Coretta had taught 3rd grade for 19 years. The Foundation's inaugural press release did not include a photograph of Nathaniel. It included a photograph of Miss Coretta, taken on the porch of the Tier-Wester Street house, her hand on the rail, smiling the way she smiled when she knew something the room did not. Nathaniel moved back to Tier-Wester Street in July. Not to his mother's house. That house he kept exactly as it was, maintaining it with the same care she had, the white lily garden in the back, growing without interruption. He bought a renovated bungalow 2 blocks north, a modest place with new floors and old bones and a front porch that faced the street and caught the evening breeze. He drove the Ford Fusion. He attended Wheeler Avenue Baptist every Sunday. He ate breakfast at Miss Gloria's diner on Blodgett Street on Saturday mornings and read the paper and left a tip that Miss Gloria thought was a mistake until it happened 3 Saturdays in a row. The Foundation's first scholarship dinner was held at Wheeler Avenue Baptist in September, in the same fellowship hall where Miss Coretta's repast had been held 6 months before. The room was full, church mothers and school principals and parents, and the first cohort of scholarship recipients, young people in their best clothes, sitting up straight the way Miss Coretta had always required. Uncle Darnell was there in his good suit, looking like a man who understood more than he had been told, and was satisfied with how things had turned out. It was Uncle Darnell who introduced Nathaniel to Lenora. She was standing near the back of the room in her Nurses Guild uniform, the same white dress and white shoes that Miss Coretta's church sisters had worn to the funeral. She was 42 years old, composed and unhurried, with the particular calm of a woman whose daily work was caring for sick children and who had long ago decided that she did not have time or patience for anything that was not real. She had known Miss Coretta for 11 years through the Guild, she told Nathaniel, and she had always admired the way Miss Coretta moved through the world, like someone who knew the value of things that didn't announce themselves. Nathaniel looked at her when she said that. They talked for a long time over sweet tea in the same fellowship hall, in the same building. 6 months after the worst morning of his life had also been the beginning of the rest of it. Miss Coretta Gaines never told anyone what she had built. She never sat at a dinner table and made Pierre Beauvais feel small. She never reached for a room's attention or announced her worth or waited for someone to recognize what she carried. She understood something that Pierre Beauvais spent 67 years failing to learn, that real power does not need a room to know it's in one. It just builds quietly for 60 years. And then one day the ground shifts and everyone discovers what was underneath them all along. Nathaniel pressed the white lily flat between 2 pages of his mother's Bible and had it framed in simple dark wood. He hung it on the wall of the Tier-Wester Street bungalow, in the hallway between the front door and the kitchen, where he would pass it every morning on his way to start the day. So now I want to ask you something. If you had been Nathaniel, if you had spent 9 years holding that kind of patience, carrying that kind of knowledge, watching the people who dismissed you build their world on a foundation you owned, what would you have done? Would you have waited as long as he did? Would you have done more? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you the way I think it did, please take a second and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. We will be back very soon with another story, another patient person, another hidden truth, another world that had no idea what was coming. You do not want to miss it. I will see you in the next one.